Chapter 28. Aisha. When Aisha and the prince returned to the Wanderer's Sanctuary Tavern, the small room was packed with market goers and travelers, and filled with the sounds of clinking glass and ringing laughter. The chaos made her miss the quiet, safe solitude of her bedroom. Now she could not afford to let her guard down. The prince and the damned talking relic were a constant concern. She was beginning to wonder if staying in Medine would have been the less annoying choice after all. They had just stepped into the tavern when the prince froze. Aisha followed his gaze to the staircase where Luli al-Nazari was descending in her brown robe. Her face was unpainted, her eyes cracked with red as if she hadn't slept. Her bodyguard was nowhere in sight. Aisha glanced at the prince. The expression of longing on his face was almost embarrassing to witness. When the merchant approached, he opened his mouth as if to say something, but then just ended up offering a cordial nod as she walked out the door without acknowledging them. He looked crestfallen. Aisha nudged him. Your love sickness is showing, Saidi. The prince flushed. I'm not. But she was uninterested in his excuse and already walking towards the stairs. By the time he caught up to her, she'd used a spare key to enter his room and spread Prince Hakim's map on his bed. I hope you didn't embarrass yourself too badly in front of the Wali. She pointed to the room's desk and he set the satchel on top and sighed. If you were so worried you should have been there, he mumbled. It would have been more productive than sulking on the stairs. Omar did not send me here to babysit you. No, that's what he told me. Leave the fighting to Aisha, he said. She'll protect you. I think you're confusing bodyguard with nursemaid. Now come. She patted the edge of the bed. Let's get this over with. The prince obediently sat on as she outlined what would be the fastest route to their final destination. She started by pointing out settlements and Bedouin campsites they would be able to rest at during their upcoming ride to Gabon, the city of waterfalls. Aisha was impressed. Prince Hakim's renderings of the cliffs and rivers were so detailed they could have been pulled from her memories. She paused, finger hovering over Gabon. Interesting. Prince Mazen looked up. What is? Your brother. When the prince simply blinked at her, she raised a brow and said, How is it that a trapped man knows the desert so well? The question seemed to take him by surprise. He squinted at the map as if he could unearth an answer from between the layers of lines and colors. Then softly he said, Before my brother came to Medine, he traveled the desert with his mother's tribe. He's seen much more of the world than I. A fond, distinct, un-Omar-like smile tugged at his lips. Aisha looked at him skeptically. It was impossible for a mapmaker to draw from memory when the landscape changed so often. After all, the oases sprang from the blood of slain jinn every day, and human villages were wiped off the map in the blink of an eye. Once, before it had been burned to the ground, her own village had been on a map like this. Aisha shook off the memory of Shamish before it could settle. Prince Hakim's cartography skills were none of her concern. All that mattered was that his map was reliable. She returned her attention to the route. There will be fewer oases once we leave Gibon, but there are caves built into cliffs that will provide good shelter. She traced the cliffs to the outskirts of the western Sansi. The last outpost is right here, at the edge of the Sansi. She circled the area with a finger. Your brother has marked caves that might lead beneath the Sansi, but there's nothing conclusive. We'll have to search by foot when we arrive. The prince nodded absently. He was taking in the map like a starving man took in a feast. She forgot that while this trip was just another journey for her, the prince had never ventured far from Medine, that this was, more or less, an introduction to a whole new world for him. So, if Dime is here, he pinned the city with his finger, then the ruin where we find the relic is. He abruptly went silent, expression morphing from one of wonder to horror. Aisha was immediately suspicious. What's that expression for? You look guilty. He swallowed. Guilty? No. The only thing I'm guilty of is injuring the merchant, and she's fine now. Aisha watched him carefully. You're still thinking about that? It could be worse than injuring someone, you know. She raised her brows. You could be expected to kill them. That's different. You choose to kill Jin. The comment, said so flippantly, should not have bothered her. But perhaps because the memory of Shamish was so raw, the words caused her thoughts to scatter. In her mind's eye she saw green gold fields. She saw her sisters swirling through the high grass, her aunts lounging beneath the date trees, and her mother standing at the front door, a plate of lukaimat, and calling everyone inside for dessert. And then she saw everything, the fields, the house, the bodies, burned to cinders. What a foolish thing to say. The words were soft when they left her lips, as faded as her vision. Not all killers choose to wield a blade. Some of us do it out of necessity. The prince looked taken aback. I thought Omar's thieves sought him out because they wanted to kill Jin. Perhaps she ought to have been annoyed that the prince was probing for information, but it had been a long time since someone asked about her life before Omar, and she found she wanted to talk about it. Her past had never been a secret. Maybe that was why no one found it valuable enough to steal from her. Perhaps, she shrugged, but it is not as if I grew up desiring to wield a blade. I lived on a farm in Shamish. The only sharp thing I was meant to handle was a sickle. But expectations change when your village is slaughtered by Jinn. Farming tools didn't keep me alive. A blade did. The prince looked at her dolefully. I'm sorry, he murmured. She looked away, unnerved at seeing such honest sympathy on Omar's face. I don't need your apologies. If there's one thing I've learned since picking up a sword, it's that empathy is weakness. You speak like a killer? You'll get used to it. She fell back against his bed and closed her eyes. Her cloak flared open with the motion, and she deduced by the prince's silence that he was looking at her scars. It's rude to stare, she said without opening her eyes. I was just looking at my scars. Are they really so fascinating? She sighed. Some people hide their scars. I prefer to wear mine like badges. They remind me of everything I survived, and of who it is I must seek revenge against. Beneath the darkness of her lids, she saw Samish again, bright, burning, dying, and she saw the smoky creatures standing amidst the destruction, eyes burning with hatred, the Jinn travelers they had welcomed into their home, repaying hospitality with violence. The prince's voice was faint. The Jinn from Samish, they are gone, but my bloodlust is not. That is why I am here, prince. She pried open an eye. Don't you have better things to do than gawk at me? The prince stood so abruptly he bumped into the table and nearly knocked over the satchel. His gaze darted to the window, to the sky now glowing with stars. I forgot something in Ahmed's residence, he muttered. I'd like to retrieve it before his meeting starts. He walked off, but hesitated at the door. Aisha, he glanced over his shoulder, eyes glimmering with hope. Thank you for opening up to me. I appreciate your honesty. Laughter burst from Aisha before she could help it. How amusing that this prince thought her sharing her past with him, a past that was so clearly written on her skin, meant anything. She was still chuckling to herself long after the prince's footsteps faded down the corridor. When she reached for his satchel and, out of habit, searched inside for the relic, the laughter died in her throat when her fingers brushed against nothing.